Sean, it's all yours.
So thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak, and thank you also for just this engaging series of programs that you have. I admire Stanislaus Audubon Society for the way that it involves people in not only local birding and ornithological interests, but also things further afield. And I'm really proud and excited to share with you tonight a bit about a species that means a lot to me. And I hope to show you a bit about why it's such an interesting species and what we can do to help ensure that this species continues to survive. To start out tonight, I'd like to ask a question. What do artists in ancient India, wildlife trackers in Borneo, and modern researchers in California all have in common? And the answer to this question is that everyone is interested in hornbills, and for a bit of a different reason. When we think of hornbills, many people think of the arboreal hornbills of Southeast Asia. These really iconic birds look quite a bit like toucans, and they fill a similar ecological niche. They are primarily frugivorous, but they will take small vertebrates. Um, they are primary seed dispersers in lowland rainforests. And they have this really bizarre looking growth on the top of their bill, which is called the casque. And in this rhinoceros hornbill on the left, it looks a bit like a tropical fruit, being orange and yellow and red. The great hornbill on the right, it looks a little bit more like it's wearing a helmet. But in each of these species of really iconic hornbills, there has long been interest. In the 1600s, this regal artist from the court of Jagandir, his name was Mansour, he painted this beautiful great hornbill that's now held in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And because of their great beauty and the fact that these horns have a consistency similar to ivory, but actually even easier to carve, these beautiful species have become the subject of wildlife trafficking. And in locations where ivory trade has been restricted, hornbill horn has become an alternative to ivory and is used in many traditional artisanal crafts. When we think of these hornbills, many people think first of arboreal hornbills. And so this is the family Buceratidae. This comprises many species of birds that live throughout Southeast Asia and also Southern Africa. And there are, 62 species, each of which has a different conservation status. While some are least concerned, many of these birds are vulnerable, threatened, or endangered. And so they're a group of conservation priority. Within those 62 species in the family Buceratidae, there are 15 different genera. And we can see here on the right-hand side a phylogeny of all of the species of hornbills that exist in the world. On At the very, very bottom, you'll see there is this very basal node to the whole phylogeny, and where it says A there. And this is the family Bucorvidae. There are just two species in this genus Bucorvis, and this is the northern and southern ground hornbill. And so these birds are considered to be an even more ancient lineage than all the rest of the tree-dwelling hornbills. So what we learn about these species can help give us a glimpse into the evolutionary past of birds throughout the rest of the family Buceratidae. And those two species of ground hornbills comprise the northern and southern ground hornbill. In both of these species, the birds are sexually dimorphic, with females and males both having very similar plumage coloration, with an overall black body, head, and neck, and white wingtips. But then these very brightly colored facial skin patches. In the northern ground hornbill, this is a primarily blue facial skin, and the males have this combination of blue and red, with females being all blue. But the Southern ground hornbill is quite the opposite, with the males being completely red and the females in the upper right having this blue patch underneath the bill. So even from a distance, you can tell the difference between male and female um, southern and northern ground hornbills. You'll also notice that there's a bit of a difference in that casque that sits on top of the bill. In the northern ground hornbill on the left, you can see that it's much more of an upright casque, and it looks a bit like it's been chopped off. It ends in this very kind of ragged, abrupt, and open end to the casque. Where on the southern ground hornbill, it's quite a bit smoother, and you're able to see um, that the casque is much reduced in comparison to many of the other species of hornbills. So thankfully, as a result of these characteristics, the southern and northern ground hornbill are not species generally that are threatened by the trade in hornbill horn. And it's the species on the right that I'm really excited to introduce to you as the main theme of our talk tonight. And the reason why I think this is such a remarkable species tracks back to many elements of its life history. Hornbills can live just about as long as people. These southern ground hornbills can live 60 to 70 years, so extremely long lifespan. And this means that they can experience things like massive changes in their environment, changes in human technology within the span of just a single generation of ground hornbills. And this will come into play quite a bit when we think later about land use change and human histories on the landscape. These birds are also quite large. They're about turkey sized, about a meter tall, and so they have a really impressive presence on the landscape. They can eat a lot of food, and they can also travel long distances as a result of this large body size. But as a result, they also have this really slow life history strategy where they actually only, at maximum, fledge one young bird per group per year. They take about 7 to 10 years to mature. And this late maturity means that they have this extended period of adolescence. So you can imagine many species of birds, they go from being in the nest to, like you could think of a songbird. It pops out of the nest. A couple of months later, it's full adult body size. It may look and act essentially like an adult. And certainly by the time it's a year old, it's ready to breed. And in some really small species of finches, for example, the young can breed at just a few months old. And so they have essentially a very curtailed life history. In the case of the ground hornbills, however, they have this long period of adolescence and social learning. And so they're spending a lot of time with the rest of the members of their group, learning how to find food and how to navigate through the landscapes where they live. And those landscapes can be pretty extensive. They have extremely large spatial requirements. In South Africa, where the species is best studied, their territory sizes can be between 80 and 100 square kilometers. So they range over vast distances looking for food, and they also defend these territories. And as a result, they're a species that's always found in low density across the landscape. Another element of this species' fascinating life history is that post-fledging investment that the parents put into their young. So there's a lot of protection of the young from predators and also teaching the young how to find food. And I'll chat a bit about their dietary requirements later, but you'll begin to see that finding food is a really important component of these birds' lives. Once they get through that adolescent phase that lasts about five years, they have very low natural mortality. So adults will live in groups that are very stable. And so these social groups can end up forming, they may form actually the basis of what some might consider cultures or societies. And this is an open area of investigation right now. And far beyond just how long it takes for the young to grow up, they also have cooperative breeding. So we'll chat a bit more about breeding in a minute, but these birds are able to help one another produce young. So there is an alpha pair that lives in every group. And these birds are the only reproductive individuals, and all the rest of the group members help them to defend their territory and care for their young. And all of the rest of the group are males. So any young females that hatch into the group are kicked out at about 1 year old and have to find their own way in the world until they're sexually mature and ready to set up their own breeding territories. And finally, these birds do live in these groups that are very stable, and they can range anywhere from 2 to 12 birds. Two birds alone cannot successfully reproduce. They need a third bird to help provision their young with food. And so if you see two birds, then they are likely hoping to recruit an additional bird to their group. So as you can see, this overview of their life history makes the Southern Ground Hornbill a really fascinating study system for all kinds of questions about ecology and the evolution of sociality, the ability to relate to other members of one species over time. Additionally, from a dietary perspective, southern ground hornbills are fascinating carnivores. So while we think of a lot of the tree-dwelling hornbills primarily for their fruit eating, southern ground hornbills will eat everything from insects, and they'll spend a lot of time eating, small beetles, especially during the dry season. But when conditions are a little bit more favorable for them, when there's a little bit more water on the landscape, and there are more lizards and snakes and frogs around, that forms the bulk of their diet. And they spend their whole day basically walking through landscapes, looking for anything that moves. And if it's small enough to fit in their bill, then they'll consume it. And if it's too large to fit in their bill, then they will communally hunt. So they will eat tortoises out of their shells. They will communally hunt and capture rabbits and hares. So one bird will scare the rabbit, and then another bird will chase it and kill it. And if there is any carrion on the landscape, any larger animals that have died, then these birds will come and um, consume them. So picking at bits of hair and hide and skin, and then also if there are bones, then they'll get calcium by pecking at the bones. So their carnivory makes this species really interesting, in part because one of the types of snakes that they eat are venomous snakes. And so these birds are digesting snake venom and need to learn how to kill snakes without being poisoned themselves by the venomous snake. And so that's a big part of this social learning period that the young have to undergo, is learning from their parents how to kill snakes and stay safe. And as I mentioned, these birds are highly social. Um, they live in groups anywhere from 2 to 12 birds. And most of these are going to be the adult offspring of the alpha pair. As a result of the fact that they live in groups and defend territories, they can recognize who is inside of their group and who is an interloper, who might have come in from another territory and be looking to disrupt things in their own group. And so they are able to recognize their kin, just like we can imagine groups of great apes or other primates or elephants being able to recognize each other. And so this gives them a really interesting. There's an interesting social dynamic in terms of understanding how these birds can recognize each other when they don't have obvious color patches in their feathers. And so we'll get into that in a minute. These birds, as I said, they breed communally, and so that is another element of their social life, is needing to decide when and where to breed, where that nest tree is going to be. And then beyond just the more kind of passive foraging for their own food, they will hunt together, eating those larger vertebrates in particular as a group. And so their lives really revolve around the fact that they are so social. They are also non-migratory, and so they are staying on the same parts of the landscape year round. and defending the borders of the territories in that landscape. And right, so they breed cooperatively. There's only one female per group, and that's the alpha female. And so there's only one nest in each territory. And because these territories can be quite vast, that means that their nest, they have a choice of nest trees in environments that have lots of trees with large holes. Um, and all the males in the group need to defend the territory because they're defending that alpha female and her nest site from other groups of hornbills. The female only ever lays two eggs. And if both of those eggs hatch, then the smaller chick starves. The parents don't feed it, and only the larger chick survives. So you can imagine that these birds are kind of adopting a an insurance policy kind of strategy in terms of wanting to ensure that that one young bird will survive, and if one egg doesn't hatch, or if one bird has some kind of an injury, then the second chick can be that insurance. But as a result, there is very low recruitment to the overall population. When you think of, anywhere from 2 to 12 birds reproducing and only one chick being added, it means that they have this really, slow life history. And so as a result, their conservation becomes really important. These species, that, while they are not, a major subject of the international wildlife trafficking trade, they do face a lot of threats across the landscape because they consume carrion. If a hunter has shot an animal using lead shot and that animal dies somewhere on the landscape, or if there are, if someone dresses an animal in the field, then the hornbills will come and scavenge and can end up consuming lead as a result of that. So lead toxicosis, especially in areas where there is a high degree of hunting, is a major cause of mortality for this species. Another issue is that because these birds are so highly territorial, if someone changes the landscape where they live, they can't necessarily move somewhere else. They may come into conflict with a neighboring group of hornbills if the land where they live is converted to agriculture or is affected by urbanization. And so this really slow life history strategy means that it's challenging for these birds to recover from any kind of losses as a result of human land use change. Additionally, these birds take so long to grow up that it's a major challenge if the nest is predated. And so, one of the challenges that they experience, especially in South Africa, is the presence of leopards as nest predators. So leopards can climb trees, which lions don't typically do. And leopards will enter the nest hole and eat young from the nest. And so while the adults can escape the nest tree and escape, this is a major cause of mortality among nestlings. In other locations throughout Africa, there are civets, which are a small carnivore that can climb trees or cross the ground, and civets can also enter the nest cavity and consume young. And so you have both these human-made causes of mortality, but also natural causes. In places where hornbills are encountering shiny objects, because they're so territorial, they will beat up their reflection in that they can see in that reflective object. And so they will often attack chrome bumpers to cars in places where they encounter cars. And if there are windows that are at ground level, then they will attack their reflection in those windows. And so, as a result of habitual window breaking by ground hornbills, they are directly persecuted in some areas. You can imagine that if you're living in a really rural area where glass is hard to come by or is really expensive, and a southern ground hornbill comes through and causes tens of thousands of dollars of damage in a single morning, then it doesn't exactly endear itself to the community. And so people persecute the hornbills as a result of that. And all of this just tracks back to their cooperative breeding and highly territorial life history. So there are two major conservation organizations that are seeking to reverse the declines of this species. One is the APNR Ground Hornbill Project that works in the associated private nature reserves in South Africa. And the other is considered kind of the flagship organization working with this species, and that's the Mabula Ground Hornbill Project. And both have been ongoing for several decades to work with this species. But when you think of a species whose life history is so long, there may be only 1 to 2 generations in to work on this species. And so it takes a long time and a lot of incremental effort to help reverse declines. But really good people are working on the ground to try to prevent declines and maintain this really magnificent species. So my work in particular is to the north of South Africa in the center of Mozambique. I work in a place called Parque Nacional da Gorongosa. This is the flagship national park of Mozambique, and has been protected area since about the 1950s when Mozambique was a Portuguese colony and the Portuguese government had a hunting reserve here. It's right in the center of the country, and it is perhaps the most dense location for ground hornbills anywhere in the world. And so for me, it makes it a really exciting place to study this particular species. The study site looks like this. This is a photo that I took just this summer. It's a floodplain driven ecosystem. So on the upper right hand side of the photo, you can see stretching into the distance is an open floodplain. This is a lake that is fed by rivers coming from a nearby mountain called Mount Gorongosa. And during the dry season, those rivers still flow because the mountain produces its own rainfall. So the lake is there year round, but during the rainy season, this whole area floods. And so you end up with this gradient from that open floodplain to woodland that you can see kind of in the upper left-hand side of the image. And in this transitional forest zone in between the woodland and the open floodplain, the ground hornbills live. And so they're often walking in between these trees, looking for food. And so this is where I go to study them. And you can see my field truck there down in the center, bottom center of the image, for a sense of scale of the landscape. It's just a very massive landscape. The national park is the size of the state of Rhode Island. While I'm there, I'm taking photos of the ground hornbills to try to look at their behavior and group composition. And of course, while I'm doing that, I also come across other wildlife, like the couple of lions that you can see through my truck window right here. Once I do that, it opens up some research possibilities. And one of those is facial patterning. So hornbills, while they don't have a lot of extensive color patches across their plumage, they do have some elements of their faces that may be the ways that they are using to recognize who is part of their group and who is an interloper. Primary among those are these sideburns, these feather tracts that extend from the neck and the back of the head down through that bare facial skin to the base of the bill. And these seem to be unique to the individual. So exactly how those feather tracts cross that bare facial skin varies in terms of the thickness of the sideburn and the shape. So that may be one important kind of metric to be using for determining who's who. The second is this facial skin around the eye. So extending back from the eye, there's this extensive patch of bare skin, and where it ends can vary in shape. In some birds, it like in this one, it comes to a point. In other birds, it's quite rounded. And in still others, it can be really oddly shaped, almost like a paisley shape. Um, Thirdly, there are these serrations on the bill, and these are kind of patterns that are worn down by these birds foraging. And so if you especially are looking at a really old bird, it tends to have a really highly serrated bill that may set it apart from other birds in its group. And then lastly, we could think about casque dimensions. So that again, that horn, that casque that sits on top of the bill, that may be a different height or different length depending on the bird. And so each of these would be a way of looking at kind of dimensions of individuality. So one of the projects that I'm undertaking is looking at these things, and I'm combining many images that I've taken in the field. These are all photos from Mozambique this past summer, to try to understand some of the variations across these hornbills. And you can see even just here, kind of looking from bird to bird, those four dimensions that I mentioned a moment ago, vary from one photo to the next. And so the hope here is that I could use, machine learning and computer vision techniques to identify the areas that have the most variation and use those to try to understand the ability for these birds to identify one another as part of their group, and also to see whether there are some consistencies across birds that are in positions of social dominance. So, does the alpha pair have a different looking face than other members of its group? Or could we look at the variation within a group and find greater similarities than between groups? And if so, we could look at the development of these facial characteristics as an inherited trait. So it's like a family all looking alike. So this is a really ripe area for exploration. And so I took several thousand facial photos of these birds this summer to try to get enough to train a computer algorithm to recognize differing portions of the face. Another area of ongoing research interest is the opportunity to study social leadership. So as I mentioned, these birds they're highly territorial, and within that territory, especially during the dry season when resources are a little bit more scarce, they spend basically all day wandering through the territory and looking for food. So one of the things that I did this past summer was I habituated these groups of birds to the presence of drones and flew the drones up above the birds and took videos of them foraging. So if you look down in the center of the image, just to the left of the tree, you can see a hornbill, and then two other members of its group just on the other sides of that tree. And I took uh, many hours of video footage, but multiple minutes of video footage with the drone kind of parked above the birds to see if there would be a way of identifying which bird is leading the group. These birds, they kind of fan out across the landscape as they look for food, but they're always generally within eyesight of one another. And so they can vary from being just like a meter or two apart to, in some cases, being more than 100 meters apart, but still within eyesight. If they do ever get separated, then they will make a booming kind of contact call to find one another in the landscape. But because these birds are so highly social and we know that they breed communally, we might be led to think that it's the alpha female who's calling all the shots. She certainly does in the reproductive season, but during the non-reproductive season, who is leading the group? Is it a democratic process, or is there maybe a single leader who is determining where the group goes? And so by taking this footage from directly above the birds, we're hopefully able to see which bird is leading and what that might mean in terms of their overall social dynamics. some moments of field work when I was flying the drone above these birds. It just felt like I was maybe studying black sesame seeds because that's kind of what it looks like in these photos and videos. These birds just are so kind of so small in comparison to the rest of the landscape. But the hope is that we can learn some remarkable things about their life histories as a result of this video footage. And finally, another area of ongoing research is territorial dynamics. So this is a map that I created out of my fieldwork this year. Each of these locations is a site where I have seen and photographed ground hornbills. And the number that's inside of the colored circle is the number of birds that was in that hornbill group. And so you can begin to see some of the ways in which the groups are spread across the landscape and can begin to infer some territorial boundaries. For example, this set of two birds that's consistently seen on this peninsula in the right-hand side of the image, they're quite distantly separated from the next observations of two birds to the left of that. And so we can imagine that these two birds are it's a two bird group, just the smallest group size possible, and that they are potentially on the lookout for another bird that they can recruit to their group. They are then bordered by this group of six, and then an additional group of two further to the west of them. And so, so this gives the opportunity to begin doing kind of a preliminary analysis of where territorial boundaries might be, but it doesn't give us the full picture. And so one of the things that I'm interested in studying with these birds is a more fine-scaled understanding of their territories. And so what I'm hoping to do is to deploy this brand new technology, which is a full GPS transmitter, but in the form of a leg band that could be affixed to these birds to see exactly where they are spending their time. And because of these tiny solar panels that are mounted on the outside of the leg band, the batteries never have to be changed. And so it gives an opportunity for really high numbers of data points to be collected on where these birds are spending time. And you don't have to recapture the bird after it's been affixed with one of these trackers. And that will become particularly interesting as we think about the fact that this is a really floodplain-driven ecosystem, where a lot of those best foraging territories are going to be places where they can eat the snakes and frogs and lizards that are capitalizing on the insects at the edge of the lake. And so when the lake expands, then the birds aren't going to be walking through water. They're truly terrestrial. And so then they need to shift their territorial boundaries further upland. And then during the dry season, they can extend much further out onto that floodplain. And so having trackers like these fixed on the birds will give us a much better sense of over the course of the year how these birds are making decisions in the landscape and what that means about other elements of not only their life history, but about how other species of territorial animals adapt to conditions that are highly variable. So there are two ways, if you're excited about all these topics, like I certainly am, there are two ways to participate in ground hornbill conservation. So that Mabula ground hornbill project that I mentioned is one of the kind of flagship organizations working with this species. They are one of the finalists with the European Outdoor Conservation Association's annual vote for funding. And so they are one of 13 organizations that's been selected for a 30,000 euro prize. And if you go to their website, you can vote for the Mabula Ground Hornbill project. It's totally free. And it tells the European Outdoor Conservation Association that ground hornbills need help and that they could use this funding. On the other hand, my work in the herd lab at the University of California, Merced, I'm trying to raise $13,000 for those trackers to be affixed to ground hornbills. The trackers unfortunately cost $500 each, and the transmitters to receive them are $1,000 each. So my hope is that I could put trackers on 20 birds and buy three transmitters in time for this upcoming field season so that we can get really high resolution data on how these birds are making their decisions in time. So, taken together, I think the ground hornbill is a really amazing species. And these facts, not only about its life history, but also what we can learn about territorial dynamics and social leadership and individual recognition, can be things that help preserve this species in the long term. And hopefully can continue to give it a really bright future in beautiful landscapes like the Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. Now, none of this work can be done alone. So first, I want to thank the Stanislaus Audubon Society for inviting me to share about this incredible species with you. And then also to my lab and the University of California, Merced for mentorship and for funding. And to the Mabula Ground Hornbill Project, I visited them in South Africa at the start of my field season, and they trained me on working with this species. And then also Gorongosa National Park, where I conduct my research. And just for images used in the presentation today, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Macaulay Library is an incredible resource for aggregating information and images on birds. So thanks to them. And with that, I would encourage you to contact me. There's my email address. Look up my website, seanclyon.com. I'd be more than happy to share more information with you about the work that I do. And at this stage, I'd be happy to take any questions.